British defense chief said on Tuesday that Russia's 10th Tank Regiment lost most of its tanks in tactically flawed frontal strikes in the eastern Ukraine town of Avdiivka. They added that Vladimir Putin's army made only marginal progress offensive in the Donetsk province, at cost of heavy losses armored vehicles. But other military experts said Russian forces, particularly Putin's private army, Wagner Group mercenaries, are gaining more ground in the town of Bakhmut, which has seen some of the war's fiercest fighting. In its latest intelligence update, the Ministry of Defense in London said that Russian generals had recently prioritized an operation to try to encircle the Donetsk town of Avdiivka. However, Russian forces made only marginal progress in armored vehicles, at the expense of heavy losses. Russia's 10th Tank Regiment probably lost most of its tanks while trying to encircle Avdiivka from the south. The losses of the 10th Tank Regiment are most likely due to tactically flawed frontal attacks similar to those in other recently failed Russian armored attacks, such as around the town of Vuhledar. The briefing added, the regiment is part of 3rd Army Corps, the first major new formation that Russia has stood up to support invasion of Ukraine since August 2022. Multiple open-source accounts have suggested that the 3rd Army Corps is dealing with particularly poor discipline and poor morale issues. Despite a possible training period in Belarus, the formation still appears to exhibit limited combat effectiveness. Avdiivka is 85 miles south of the heavily devastated mining town of Bakhmut, which the War Studies Institute, a Washington-based think tank, says Russian forces have gained more ground in recent days. Ukraine closed Avdiivka to civilians on Monday after an official described the town as a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The Ukrainian military warned that Avdiivka, who had fallen to rubble in months of fighting, which both sides described as a meat grinder, could become a second Bakhmut. Russian forces say they are fighting street to street. Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, who said a counterattack this month was not far off, visited the eastern frontline troops and said his forces continue to repel attacks on Bakhmut. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials said air defense systems shot down 12 drones near Kiev on Monday, and the falling debris set fire to an uninhabited area. No casualties were reported. The Ukrainian military said earlier Tuesday that Russia launched a total of 15 Iranian-made Shahd drones into Ukraine overnight, and Ukrainian forces destroyed 14 of them. The logic actions Russians is terrorism targeting civilian infrastructure, said Andriy Yermak, Chief General Staff Presidency Ukraine, on Telegram regarding drone attacks. Just like geopolitical blackmail, it won't work. Since Putin's invasion stopped, he and other Russian officials have played the odds that the war could escalate to include nuclear weapons. On Saturday, he said he had struck a deal to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Ukraine and its Western allies criticized the plan. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russian troops of holding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant hostage, and its safety could not be guaranteed until they left. Since first weeks of Ukrainian occupation, Russian troops have occupied nuclear power plant, largest in Europe, and has shown no inclination to relinquish control. Keeping a nuclear power plant hostage for more than a year, this is absolutely worst thing to happen the history of nuclear power in Europe or around world, he said his nightly video talk. He described the Russian presence as radiation blackmail. His comments came after a meeting with Rafael Grossi, Director General of International Atomic Energy Agency, at the Dnipro hydroelectric power station, northeast of Zaporizhzhia plant. In comments posted on the presidential website, Zelensky said attempts to restore safety and order before Russian soldiers withdraw from the factory were doomed to fail. Russia and Ukraine routinely accuse each other of being the Zaporizhzhia plant. Fighting around him and fears of water shortages and cooling systems losing power have heightened fears of a nuclear disaster. Since September, an IAEA team has been at the factory, which Kiev accuses of using Moscow as a shield for troops and military hardware. Mr. Grossi has repeatedly called for a safety zone in the vicinity and will be visiting it again this week. He tried to negotiate with both sides but said in January it became difficult to broker a deal. Zaporizhzhia is one of 4 regions Russia claims to have annexed in September, following referendums around the world that have been criticized as fake. Russia sees the plant as its territory, which Ukraine denies. Zelensky visited southeast Zaporizhzhia on Monday, the final phase of tour of frontline areas since a top general said Ukrainian counteroffensive was imminent.